Tell me about your role in the UBC farm. How has your personal role evolved in the Vancouver food system?
Well, first of all, my name is Hannah Lewis, and I have the great honor of working here on unceded ancestral Musqueam territory at the UBC farm. I've been working here 5 seasons as the Indigenous programs liaison, and I also work with one of those 4 Indigenous programs that's here on site. So I support the 4 different Indigenous initiatives here in the programming that they do, and I help liaise among them, between them and the UBC farm, as well as connecting them with students. In terms of my role in the food system in Vancouver, I think I see myself as someone who helps facilitate healing and land-based cultural work among urban Indigenous communities in Vancouver, and I think that that intersects with the food system in a lot of ways, because it very literally helps a lot of the participants to these projects gain access to food, whether it's traditional foods or foods that are new to them. And that's, I guess, a very literal part of their food system, but I don't see our programs as necessarily providing large quantities of food at a market scale the way other parts of the UBC farm does. If that makes sense.
Great. Is there any aspect of your work that you feel touches on issues of sustainability? Tell us about these.
Yes, I think it all has to do with sustainability in a lot of different ways. I'm working, the great privilege of working with Indigenous peoples in this territory and peoples from other territories is that a lot of their concepts about how to move forward into the future and how to have good relationships with each other and with the land are concepts that you see the more Western idea of sustainability echoing. So a lot of the same things around having healthy and respectful and reciprocal relationships with other human beings and with all of creation in a way, which includes the land and all the other things that live on or live with the land. And that includes making sure that all those things are sustained long term and respecting their being and their future as well. So I think from that perspective it aligns really well. We often talk about the UBC farm being sort of a place where people can come and explore concepts of food system sustainability. And I think it's really unique. We're one of the only university farms that I know of that is rooted in Indigenous territory and knowledge the way we are, because if we want to think about how to live sustainably on this piece of land, I don't think we can do it without talking to the people who've lived sustainably on it for tens of thousands of years. And I also think it's a matter of respect too, of making sure that they're a really important part of the process, envisioning the next thousands of years on that land. So I think sustainability and working with Indigenous knowledges and relationships to land go really well together and make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, sometimes a lot of dialogue in environmental communities leaves out Indigenous perspectives, realities, and peoples, but I'm really excited to see that on the West Coast in the last few years I've seen that shift changing a lot, and especially with things around pipelines and access to traditional territories. I'm seeing a lot of Western environmental groups who have a sustainability focus reaching out to First Nations and to Indigenous communities and that relationship building. So I see that happening here at the farm in the same way.
What do you see as the biggest challenge to the sustainability of the current food system in the Lower Mainland?
If I had to put it in one word, I might say intersectionality. I think, and by that I mean recognizing that there are many different things that are intersecting around food. So when we talk about food sustainability and the food system in Vancouver, we have to acknowledge, for example, who is accessing that food, and how things like race and culture, gender and class all play into where people can access that food system, at what points they come into the food system, what their barriers might be, and what their access points might be, and what their needs from that and their hopes and visions from that food system might be, can differ across those different things. And I think a lot of discussions that happen often focus on food system needs for particular groups, folks who are upper middle class, folks who are white, folks in a particular demographic. And so I think in the future it needs to be a bit more intersectional in terms of recognizing that folks living with other realities around class and race have different needs. And I also think a big thing that concerns me is access to farmland. I think watching what's happening to the ALR right now really concerns me, where a lot of ALR farmland is a really unique thing that we have in BC, that this farmland's protected and a lot of it is getting lost, especially to development, whether it's housing or whether it's potential resource extraction. And I think that's happening alongside the same thing happening to Indigenous territories. And people are seeing a lot of that. How do those two struggles overlap? And so that's a concern of mine as well. And the high cost of farmland for young farmers really worries me too, because if we want to feed Vancouver from the local region, things like urban farming are incredibly important for education. Programs like this are amazing for people's healing journeys, but they won't provide the quantity of food that we need in the city. And that's where I think protecting the farmland outside of the city is really, really important, and that's something that worries me. So recognizing all those different points and how they intersect is really what I think is the most important thing to focus on as we move forward into the food system in the future.
What changes over the past 40 years have impacted the UBC farm most significantly?
Well, I've only been here for 5. But learning more about the history of the farm, I've heard that it used to be really at the center of campus and started to get pushed outwards around the same time in the 50s or 60s that agriculture started to get pushed out of cities and out past the suburbs and even further out, in the same way that it was no longer a big focus anymore and it wasn't a priority. So it's really interesting to see that disconnect that people started to have in Western culture from their food and where it comes from being represented and replicated at UBC, almost in the way that the farm got pushed out and, from what I understand, was out into the valley. And this particular site wasn't really in operation as a farm, I don't think, until about 2000, when students started to get involved here and turn it into what it is now. So there have been a lot of changes in that way. And I think the shift, though, back to having farming happening here on campus also reflects that shift happening in our culture that I'm seeing as well. People being more interested in where their food comes from, taking more sovereignty over their food system and saying that they should have a say in what it looks like. And from the perspective of the Indigenous initiatives here, they've been involved since the very beginning, since the farm first started up in the shape that it is now in 2000. And they've played a really big role in that. And I'm seeing that shifting and growing with that as well, too, in a really positive way. Is Foxy in the frame in a way that is bad news, or should I?
Well, she's sort of been
I can't
just...
see her right now.
She has been wandering in the frame quite a bit.
Which is fine, though, I feel like.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Do you think it's too distracting?
No, no, the
My
ones that
only
I've
thought
seen,
is that if
she's
you're
like
cutting things
barely-
together later, you may find like she's right there and then all of a sudden she appears there or whatever. But
Right.
it's...
Foxy, why don't you come over here, girl?
Yeah, why do you have to stand right there? I have something I can throw for you. There's no wood around here. Foxy, come. Should we find a stick? Come on, Foxy. We wander off there. Yes, things smell good over there. Okay.
Okay. Where do you see the UBC farm in the future?
Oops, I moved a little bit. Where do I see the farm in the future? Well, everything that's happening at the farm is growing exponentially right now. It's amazing and really inspiring to see, and even just watching the numbers climb of people who are coming out and visiting and getting involved in the Indigenous initiatives has grown hugely since I started here. I see the sales of produce at the farm growing. I see academic connections growing. So I feel really optimistic about where it's going. I see that the faculty is taking much more ownership over the farm and feeling much more connected, and it feels like we're more rooted in the university than we used to be, as before it felt a bit more like a satellite to the university. I could see a lot more academic connection happening into the future, a lot more connections that are already starting to take off, which is exciting, but even more with classes and with research really being a formalized part of academics at UBC and here as a place for place-based outdoor learning in that sense. I see it continuing to be a real community hub it's an incredible place for healing and community building already, and I see that definitely growing. I feel really excited about the potential for a new farm center to be built. I know fundraising has already started for that, and it's on the horizon maybe in the next few years, and I think having facilities that can actually meet the needs of the programming that's here, which have well outstripped the facilities that we currently have. Like sharing one small kitchen among hundreds of projects that run kitchen workshops and things like that. I think when we have new facilities, it'll really give us the space to grow. I see it being a real hub for learning and change, and it makes me really excited.
Could you tell us about the historical role of Indigenous agriculture at UBC?
I don't really know I'm not sure what Indigenous agriculture is, to be honest. I think, like in this region, Indigenous people's foodways haven't been agricultural. They've been focused on things like roots and berries and cultivation practices that mimicked agriculture in a lot of ways, of coming back to the same areas, taking care of it in certain ways. But fishing and game and things like that, I don't know it's in the same way that, for example, the Maya peoples are agricultural. And I also don't know the history at the university specifically with those things. But at the farm, are you asking about the future or the history of it?
The history, or maybe like who lived here, or you could tell us about that.
Well, we're on Musqueam territory, so this, like, very literally, we're standing on Musqueam territory. We're a 5-minute drive from the reserve. I've met many folks from the community who've spoken about their life growing up on this territory and their relatives. This territory where we're standing was an important place for many different things, for learning, for food, for ceremony. I'm not an expert in Musqueam history myself, though. There are folks at UBC who study that more than me, and Musqueam is a really active and vibrant community today, and I'm sure they'd be excited to share more as well. But I think that's kind of the extent of what I know. I work with some folks who know a lot about the medicines that have been traditionally harvested here, and that's probably the area that I'm fortunate enough to learn the most. But that's about it for me, yeah.
What are the traditional practices and crops grown? Have these methods changed over time?
By the Musqueam people or in the Indigenous programs here at the farm?
Probably the ones at the farm.
The Indigenous programs here at the farm have grown a variety of different foods. For example, the Maya and Exile garden grows their traditional crops, which focus on the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, with seeds from their territory that they grow as a way to carry that knowledge forward into next generations, especially as they raise their families here very far away from their home territories. They often say that corn is to them what salmon is for Indigenous peoples on the coast here, so really important part of their culture, their ceremonies, their identity. So it's really great that we can see them doing that here and sharing that food. They even sell it at the farmers market, so they're very generous with that traditional food with the community. They grow lots of other stuff as well. They grow different kinds of traditional greens and different kinds of veggies. Here in the Tuash Garden Project, which is right behind me, and also the Musqueam Garden, they grow a variety of different seasonal foods. The majority of them would not have been grown traditionally in this territory, but it's a part of recognizing people's lives today are different than they were traditionally, and there's ways to bring together traditional food ways, like working with the smokehouse, which is down there, bringing in food from the ocean and smoking fish and meats and things like that. They're combining those traditional food ways with the food ways that people have access to today now, that are a part of their lives regardless. So people who are living in cities or in rural areas, being able to grow their own vegetables and foods can be a really big part of their health as well. And so a whole variety of different veggies and herbs get grown here, as well as some really interesting different types of fruits and things like that. And then just across the way in the Indigenous Health Garden, similar thing, a lot of vegetable and herb crops, a lot of medicine plants are being grown there, about 40 different varieties of medicines, the majority of which are native to this region. and then a few different traditional foods. So for example, there's a native onion called nodding onion you can find growing around here that's grown in there and eaten, as well as some squash that, much like the squash grown in the Maya garden, is from seeds that have been saved for thousands and thousands of years in this part of the world. So quite a variety of different foods from a range of different backgrounds.
We read about the DTES community engagement on the website and are wondering if you could provide us with more information regarding this project. Could you tell us about the purpose, methodology, and the results of this program?
So the program you're referring to is called the Tuasht Project, which is a word that means we belong in a Halkomelem language, and it's run through the Vancouver Native Health Society, which is a great organization that runs different programming in the downtown east side around health for urban Indigenous peoples. And their program has been here at the farm since about 2005, I believe. Their garden is right behind me, and they do an incredible community kitchen here every Tuesday all year long. They bring different groups out. Their mandate is really to support urban Indigenous peoples in creating Indigenous space to connect holistically with the land, and through that it becomes a healing journey for people. So I've heard stories of participants who were living on the street and dealing with mental health or addictions issues, and coming out and doing something like working with the smokehouse, which was traditional to their territory, but is something they couldn't access living in the city. That actually helped them heal from some of the challenges that they were dealing with. So culture itself becomes a healing thing, and culture is something you can't separate from land. So it's really special that it gets to happen here. We often hear participants saying things like, you know, this is just the one day of the year I get to leave the downtown east side and be here, where I get to see eagles flying above me, I get to smell the fresh air, I get to stand on the land, and I just don't see concrete around me for the day. And that in itself is so healing. The project is a real inspiration for everybody. They've had some incredible research happen through UBC around the impacts of the program for health and well-being of its participants. They bring out a lot of different youth groups week to week. Last year they traveled to Tanaha territory in the interior and worked with elders and community members there to build this beautiful teepee, which is not traditional to Musqueam territory, but is traditional to lots of plains cultures, and acknowledging that the urban Indigenous community of the downtown east side is very diverse where people's territories are from, and a lot of folks are from plains regions, and so coming out here and seeing something like that they recognize it's from their own culture can be really transformative to take part in and to be in that space, and part of recognizing how diverse urban Indigenous people are today through that project.
How are the Indigenous views and traditions reflected in the Centers for Sustainable Food Systems objectives?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier the ways that Indigenous concepts of land and culture can be echoed a lot in the language we hear around sustainability already. So I think those things already make a lot of sense about how do we want to think about a good way to walk this land into the future that fosters healthy relationships among people and ecological communities. But I also have seen in the mandate of the center the commitment to being an agent of social change. And I think that means recognizing a long history of colonization that urban Indigenous and rural Indigenous people still face today, the legacies of which include intergenerational traumas from residential schooling, policies that police people's identities, or legacies of abuses and health challenges that mean people aren't living in their home territories but are living in a city where they don't find a lot of support. And so I think everybody has a shared responsibility to what that legacy looks like moving forward, and I'm happy to see that that's also something that's a priority for the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, is being a part of that network that wants to change that history to move towards a shared future that is much more respectful, sustainable, and integrated in a way that works for everybody involved.
Food security is an issue in the greater Vancouver area. How do you think it has affected the Indigenous traditional food systems?
Well, I think Indigenous traditional food systems have been affected before Vancouver was ever a city. I think as soon as colonization started in this continent, I think Indigenous communities were feeling an impact on their food systems. They're incredibly resilient, and I'm really excited to see the ways that they've persisted through that. But everything from smallpox wiping out entire Indigenous communities, where the people who might have known the knowledge about where to go catch the fish and how to smoke it suddenly just disappeared. Whole communities lost that aspect of the food system. Whether it's something like that, or whether it's something like residential schooling, where you have multiple generations of Indigenous people who were taken out of their homes and didn't have the opportunity to grow up learning how to harvest and cook with and live with their traditional foods, instead being in a schooling system where, from stories I've heard, the food was terrible, and there were even allegations of nutritional experiments being done on the children there around starvation, things like that. It's pretty horrifying to think about what that does to a traditional food system, because really the system is based on the knowledge that gets passed on generation to generation. So I think before there even was a Vancouver, I think those food systems were feeling the impacts of colonization, but I think they've persisted throughout, and I'm really excited to see the ways that that knowledge continues and people are still so engaged with foodways all across the continent. And here at the UBC Farm, the Indigenous programs that we work with, we see a lot of traditional foodways being celebrated. A lot of community members come out and say, oh, my grandma used to make me this dish with soap berries, and I haven't seen them in years. I don't even know where to find them when I live in the city. I don't, who do I go to? Oh, I haven't had moose in months and months and months, and I know it's the time of year, and I'd love to get access to it. And so it's exciting to see a place where that sharing and harvesting can happen. And there's incredible groups like the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Network, the Vancouver Island Indigenous and Coastal Community Food Network, VICAFIN. They're all doing really amazing things, helping lift up communities and help them share their traditional food knowledge to really reignite those traditional foodways, which are such a big part of people's culture, identity, and health.
Great. Those were all our questions
Yeah.
for you.
Woohoo.
So that was awesome.
Thanks.